If you're not here, last week we started into a series on forgiveness. And we are going through an incredible book, and I'll recommend it to you again. If you haven't bought it, I suggest reading it. It's called As We Forgive. And it details stories of forgiveness that follow the genocide that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. Like many in Rwanda, Rosaria is a farmer. Yet as she works, the simple labor takes much longer for her because the nerves in one of her hands no longer work. She's one of the survivors, a Tutsi. She had been left for dead when some of her neighbors attacked her. They laid her back open with machetes, but she wasn't worth the cost of a bullet to kill her. And yet now she works to finish her harvest, and as she works, she waits for a man named Saveri, who was a Hutu, to come and help her. Saveri did not grow up hating the Tutsi, the two tribes found there in Rwanda. He grew up and he was indoctrinated through radio broadcasts calling them cockroaches. Anytime, generally speaking, in history, when you hear people referring to another group by inhuman terms, they are cockroaches, they are the other, it makes it easier to commit atrocities against them. A politician at a rally said, "The person whose neck you do not cut is the one who will cut yours." So finally, in 1994, when the killing began, the Hutu, Saveri included, killed the Tutsi at a rate 5 times higher than the mechanized Nazi gas chambers. All the more horrible because it wasn't done in a factory. This was neighbor killing neighbor. Now, Saveri objected at first. One of the community leaders came and grabbed him and some of his friends and led them to a place where a mother and her 2 children were hiding. He had her neighbor dig a grave, and he had them sit in it, and then he handed one of the men a spiked club and told him to beat them to death. When the man refused, the community leader beat that man severely and set him aside and said that anybody who refused to cooperate and take part would receive the same treatment. He then handed the club to Saveri. Saveri did not refuse, and though others joined in the killing, he was the first one to deliver a blow. The mother's name was Christine. She was Rosaria's sister. We may wonder, as we hear these accounts, what could possibly bring a human being to do something so horrible? In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said that murder begins with hatred in the heart. And instead of the hatred, he follows up with giving a command of what we are to do. Matthew chapter 5, verse 23. Therefore, instead of starting down the road that leads to murder, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Talked last week that you can't just wait around in your life assuming that these broken relationships are going to fix themselves. God commands you to take an active part in fixing things. So he says, if you're there and you're about to put that tithe check in the offering plate, as important as you might think that is, if you'd give any gift to God, he says the most important thing you can do is to go and find someone that has something against you and make things right. Now, a lot of times when we talk about forgiveness, we assume that we're going to be in the position of other people who've wronged us, and we need to struggle to forgive them. In fact, I've preached on forgiveness, and I've used this verse and kind of glossed over the fact that Jesus is describing the opposite situation. You are the one that's messed up. And he says, you need to go to that person that you wronged and make things right. And really, I think this is the most important step of the whole forgiveness process. It is the first step. Now, there are situations, and we are commanded in the Bible, if somebody does not admit their wrong to us, we're still to forgive them. But it makes it a lot harder. And it makes it impossible to get to those later stages of reconciliation and restoration we'll get to in a few weeks here. But we are to go. So healing will not begin until you are willing to go to that person and own up to the wrongs that you have done them. Now, more often we're pretty aware of the people that have wronged us. We generally don't have any problem drawing up a list of those kinds of situations. But we become very stubborn when it comes to admitting a situation where we are wrong. There is this period of silence that most couples know. It is the period of time that begins when a man makes his first wrong turn and ends when he openly admits it to his wife in the car with him. We've all been there, and even GPS hasn't fixed the problem, because I've been in the car with Sarah, and the GPS tells me to turn left. I'm like, I know where I'm going. And she doesn't say anything. She lets me wait until I say, all right, I should have turned back there. And that period of time, it really depends on the person in the situation. If you think the person sitting next to you is stubborn, last year there was a couple, an elderly couple, they set out just to go down the road to visit their son for Thanksgiving. They left on Tuesday. 3 days later, they started in Oklahoma. They called their son, said, yeah, we're somewhere in St. Louis. I think we might be lost. Now I can't imagine that kind of situation. I mean, what is the wife doing for 3 days? She must be a saint. So after this horrible 100 days of killing, nearly 1 million people dead, rather than face the wrongs that they had done, many of the Hutus responsible for the killing just fled the country entirely. Others tried to cover up any evidence of their wrongdoing. I want you to consider those that were successful in hiding their crimes, never faced prosecution. Do you think that their efforts paid off? Do you think that they had peace after that point? Have you ever been around somebody, maybe you've worked with somebody who is never wrong? Isn't it amazing that in every situation they happen to find themselves in, no matter what machine is broken, no matter what has gone wrong, it just so happens that it's always somebody else's problem? Some of you are laughing. Don't look at the person next to you. They wonder then why drama always follows them and their relationships tend to fail. Severi describes the aftermath of what he felt after his own participation in those crimes. He said, something happened to me. I was not the same. I was void of peace in my heart from that moment. And like others that fled, he went and turned himself into the authorities, but the guilt did not go away. He couldn't really grasp the idea of mercy. And so he would sit there all day long imagining punishments that he would deserve, death just being too simple. He spent 9 years in a cramped prison, so crowded that they would sleep laying crosswise on top of each other. Severi had turned himself in. He even promised himself from the beginning that he would offer no excuse, no justification for his actions. And yet peace was not something the state could give him. Even if they had released him and said, you are free from all charges, there was something lacking there. When you wrong other people, you sin against God. And that is something that even if you were to receive a pardon from the president himself, in whatever situation you're dealing with, it would not absolve you of the fact that you have to deal with God. David wrote in Psalm 51, he had gone and had an affair with another man's wife, and then he had that man killed to cover it up. And he writes Psalm 51 as he struggles with the aftermath after God brings conviction. He says something very interesting, Psalm 51 verse 4. He says to God, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. Now we might look at it very differently and say, well, you killed a dude. You have something wrong to do. You have wrong to him, and yet he said that primarily he needed to make things right with God. Let me tell you that you can't hire a lawyer to take on God for you.
That's right.
Try and get, well, actually, people have tried. There was actually a state senator a few years ago who brought a lawsuit against God. But it was thrown out of court because, having no fixed address, the Almighty could not be served with the due notice. There is no arguing with God, no bargaining, no deal making. What could you possibly offer to God that he doesn't already have or that he needs from you? Instead, Jesus comes to us with a simple offer. Our unrighteousness and rebellion for his perfection and holiness. Our sin for his righteousness, his death to give you life. Luke 19, starting in verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Tax collectors during that time, they were tasked by the Romans with collecting the taxes the people owed the Roman government. How they made their living is that they collected more than they were owed, they got to pocket the rest. So it tells you something about Zacchaeus, that he was not only a tax collector, but a wealthy one. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Zacchaeus was an evil man, and the people's reaction to what Jesus says is almost like, Jesus, you could have picked anyone in the crowd. Why did you pick the most evil person of the whole bunch? Jesus sought Zacchaeus out, not seeking a bargain or a deal, but with a simple offer. Jesus sends us out in the same way. And into Severi's life, he sent a pastor named Gehigi. He was a Tutsi, jailed twice before the genocide for preaching that hate is a terrible evil. Like many Tutsi, he suffered loss in the killings. After the genocide, Gehigi had 8 living family members out of 150. All the rest had been killed. It took him a long time to work through the grief and the anger, and yet Jesus had a mission for him. Just as Jesus picked out a very sinful person in the crowd to reach out to, Jesus sent Gehigi into the prisons to preach the gospel to the people responsible for the killings. And so he goes in and he ends up embracing and sharing Jesus with his sister's killer. That kind of love poured into our life. That freedom unexpectedly from the punishment we deserve. That is the only thing that will conquer your pride and your stubbornness and your unwillingness to admit you're wrong. And if you're having trouble with this, if you're one of those people and the word simply will not leave your mouth to say, I was wrong, I invite you to spend time considering what Jesus has done on your behalf, because here was Zacchaeus' response. Jesus comes, says, Zacchaeus, I want to eat with you. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So when they began this project of restoration in Rwanda, they called it the Amuvu Tree Project. Because they read this story of Zacchaeus, and they said if Zacchaeus had been in Rwanda, he would have climbed an Amuvu tree. Those sycamore big trees there. Zacchaeus, in response to the forgiveness that Jesus offered, immediately confessed his wrongs. Can you imagine the shock of the people around? Because I imagine before this point, he had been accused of being a cheat and a liar many times. But he was wealthy. And so I'm sure Zacchaeus passed it off as, look, it's only business, all right? I'm just doing my job. And a little more. He'd see those people in the street. And they walk down the other side. And I imagine him as being just that defiant kind of person. He's continued in this for a long time. And yet Jesus invites himself over to dinner. And all of a sudden, that guy, that Zacchaeus, instead of saying, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm just doing my job, he's like, I cheated all of you. Some jaws were being scraped off the floor when he followed that up. Not only have I cheated you, I want to pay back what I've stolen. Now, this isn't some kind of bargain, and notice the timing here, because this is important. It is not that Zacchaeus came to Jesus and said, Jesus, I'll pay everybody back if you'll forgive me. Jesus expressed love to him first. His offer to pay back was an expression of remorse and joy. Because sometimes people try and bargain with God. Maybe you know somebody who's trying to go to God with some kind of bargain. Like, God, if you'll get me out of this. Got a sailor in the middle of the sea, and the ship's about to sink, and he says, God, if you'll just get me out of this, I'll sell my house and give all the proceeds to charity. And then the worst thing happens. The storm stops.
Yes.
And now he's in a real bind. So the guy goes and he puts his house up on the market for $5. And when people show up to, wow, why are you selling the house? He's like, well, here's the deal. If you buy the house, you also have to buy my cat. It's very expensive. And so he sells the house and the cat together, and he gives $5 to charity and gets himself out of the bind. I want you to understand that you cannot bargain with God like that. He just offers forgiveness. And the only way that we get God's grace is as a gift. And because it is a gift, we respond in the same way Zacchaeus did. I was one of those people who was never at fault. I still am sometimes. I'm going to share about that next week. I remember, as a student, marching into the professor's office, and he was about to fail me for the second semester in a row for the same class. And the reason why was pretty simple. I literally never did a single homework assignment. And yet the attitude that I had as I marched into that room was literally, this is your problem. Somehow, in all of this, it's your fault. I deserve to pass. It's your problem that I'm failing. And then Jesus stepped in. And when he forgave me and when that finally sank in, I began to draw up a list of everybody I could think of that I had wronged. And I looked them up, and I asked for their forgiveness. I reached out to a gay student in high school, and I was incredibly cruel to. I reached out with great care to ex-girlfriends and family members that hadn't spoken to me in years for good reason. Because I had been forgiven. And I no longer had to act like I had some defense lawyer whispering in my ear, telling me never to admit anything. Severi went to a series of meetings at the Amuvu Tree between the survivors and the murderers. And so they set up these meetings in these communities as the government had released again some 60,000 of these people from the prisons where they had been held back into the communities where they killed. And so then they had these meetings. We've got to deal with this. And the goal was not to force forgiveness, though. It was to create a safe place for the killers to offer apology and some kind of restitution as Zacchaeus had, and to say that they had changed. And it also gave the families an opportunity to show their feelings and learn the details of their loss. Now, can you imagine if Severi had gone in there and gone up to Rosario and said, "You better forgive me for this"? You know, sometimes we do the same when we wrong someone. We go to them and we act as though forgiveness is something that they owe us. We're angry with them if they don't give it back to us. Forgiveness is nothing that you can demand from another person any more than you can demand it from God. So again, the starting point for us is God's forgiveness for us. There is fear, if you can imagine. Fear from the prisoners just being afraid to see the face of the survivors that they had hunted. Some of them going there and saying to someone's face, "I spent many sleepless nights because you were still alive and I hadn't found you yet to kill you." Fear is something that holds some of us back from admitting our wrongs. Maybe you've gone to somebody before and you have confessed to them you're wrong in a situation, and they, in return, have clobbered you over the head with it for the next decade. Maybe you have fear today because you don't think healing is possible. You don't think that that person could ever forgive you or ever change. And let me tell you, if you are refusing to go and confess your wrongs because you don't think change is possible, that's why we're reading this account. If God can bring healing between genocide victims and murderers, are you really going to look at him and say that he can't heal that relationship in your life? If you are sitting and refusing to go and confess to someone your wrongs because you don't think God can possibly bring healing to the situation, I've got an uncomfortable truth for you. You are belittling God to justify your disobedience. I'm saying that to myself as well. Some of you are waiting instead for that person to come and confess to you. Now, the situation in Rwanda, this is very one-sided. Jesus doesn't say, if you're there at the altar presenting your gift, wait there until that person comes to you. We create these Cold War situations where both sides is stubbornly sitting there waiting for the other side to admit that they're wrong. Jesus commands you to go to them. Rosaria had been in another area during the killings. She wanted to know what happened to her family. So she came to the meeting as well. The first 3 meetings, Severi went up to her and begged her for forgiveness. Now, sometimes the killers would just do this in general. Somebody who just killed somebody would go to a survivor and just, in general, beg for their forgiveness. And he didn't say why. The 4th time she asked, and he replied, I am the one who murdered your sister and your children. I am begging you to forgive me. Now here, again, is an important difference. If you are going to someone to confess and to seek their forgiveness, ask for their forgiveness. Because sometimes what we do is we say, I'm sorry you got hurt. Isn't that easy? See, there's nothing they can do with that. I'm just sorry. If you ask for their forgiveness, you are putting yourself in a vulnerable situation because they can say no. And when we just go to the other person and we just say, I'm sorry, I can drop that and leave it there. I require nothing from the other person. Severi could have just said, I'm sorry they died. Instead, he is asking for something from the other person. And that's a lot harder. He's asking something from Rosaria that he did not deserve. And that is a lot harder. And the only reason that he could again do that is because God had forgiven him first. See, when I am confident of God's forgiveness of me, I am not dependent on another person's response. I'll say it again, because sometimes we do that. Because God has forgiven me and He's declared me free of charge, I do not rely on another person forgiving me. So when I went out and I contacted those people that I had wronged in my life, some of them never replied. To this day, some of them have never said another word to me. I'm okay with it. I wish for their good that they would reach out and begin the process of healing. But I'm not going to hunt them down. Severi had seen some of the victims show rage, or just leave and never come back. And so he braced himself for Rosaria's response. And she spoke the words, I forgive you. Can you imagine that kind of relief? For 9 years, he had imagined the punishment that could be inflicted on him to somehow make these things right. And here he meets her, and she just says the words. God had already forgiven him, but now to receive that from another person. And let me tell you, you are cheating yourself. If you are sitting there pleading the fifth in your life, sitting behind the lawyers in your mind, you are cheating yourself. I want you to consider at the end of this, Severi and maybe one of the people in the same village, maybe one of those who had also taken a club to that woman and her children and yet never turned themselves in. They thought themselves free while he sat in prison. They might have considered him a fool as they walked around. So there he's in prison. That fool, I am free. And yet I submit to you that at the end of this, Severi had attained a freedom that they would never taste. And that they remained locked in a prison that no guard could ever release them from. It begins when, in response to God's love for us, we have the response of Zacchaeus. So I want to tell you today, do not remain in jails of your own making. Do not sit there thinking that you can just avoid the consequences by never fessing up and never being the one in the wrong. Allow God's grace to work in your heart. In response to that, maybe some of you need to make a list today that you've never done before. An incredibly dangerous thing to do. That you have some people that you need to go to. Hey, don't even wait for the closing song to be done. If you need to just leave church as soon as I begin talking, go to that person and be reconciled. Let's pray. God, you know how stubborn we are. God, how difficult those words are to say. Yet something as minor as ignoring the GPS, or something so great that that person has not spoken to us since. God, I pray that you would give us that freedom that comes from knowing that we can stand before you because you stood in our place. That like Severi, we may sit there and imagine some kind of punishment that we might deserve, and yet you declare us free of charge. God, that kind of grace, it doesn't even make sense to us sometimes. That you would just fill us with that thought, and that because of your forgiveness, we can go and confess to other people the ways that we've hurt them. Not demanding anything out of them in return. Not trying to bargain with them and offer some payment of settlement in response for their forgiveness. Just to make things right. God, I pray that this church would be filled with the peace that comes from restoration. In Jesus' name.